Hi, welcome to week 2 on August Wilson's Fences. I'm Dr. Harkulich and I will be guiding you through today's lesson in our Intro to Theater class. Here's what we're going to cover today in this video. We're going to go over dramatic structure. We're going to go over the basic terms and define them of what dramatic structure means. We're going to look at what protagonist and antagonist means, and we're going to get an initial understanding of August Wilson and where the play Fences fits into his work. So, let's get started. What is dramatic structure? Dramatic structure is how a play's scenes are structured to tell the story and convey action and meaning in the best way possible. There isn't just one way to put a story together. Drama is conflict. So when we're thinking about how we put a story together, and we saw this in Trifles last week, we want to think about which event goes where. Trifles is a one-act play. Everything happens in one scene. In Fences, there's a whole lot more action going on, and the playwright has to decide which order all of the events will go in. That's what we mean by dramatic structure. It might seem like everything has already been assigned by the playwright when they write it, and of course it must go that way. This is the one best way. But in reality, you should be able to think about what would happen if we got different bits of information first. What would happen if the play was put in backwards order? Harold Pinter wrote a play called Betrayal, which we get all of the events in backwards order. So each scene, we start at the scene closest to the present moment, and each scene takes us backwards in time, which is a totally different way to structure a play than if we saw the beginning scene and saw everything lead up to the end, if that makes sense. We see this in murder mystery TV shows all the time in terms of which scene goes where we'll get the murder, the discovery of the body, or the murder happens, and then we jump ahead to the discovery of the body. We don't see any of the information that happens to that body in between, and they'll jump backwards and forwards in time. These are all different types of dramatic structure, but the important thing is that each one of them is showing us the best way to display and perform the conflict between characters in the story, between society and the protagonist in the course of the drama. Now we're going to look at some dramatic structure terms. These are the words that you need to know to understand what is happening in the play. This vocabulary will give you the words to describe all of the different parts of the action. So, first, an act. Last week, we read a one-act play. Everything was in a singular act. An act is an organizing unit of action in a play. An act can be short or it can be long. For a long time, we had what was called a well-made play, which was a 3-act drama. Shakespeare writes in 5 acts. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can use an act, but an act generally contains multiple scenes, which is a smaller unit of play's action. It's one particular moment. It's either delineated by the author, and they've decided that this one unit of action is a scene. We only want to see this one small part of the whole of the action. Or by entrances and exits of a character. We call that a French scene. And that comes out of French writing in the 17th century, where you would mark the scene's beginning and end by when a particular character would enter and when that character would then exit later in the scene. So that's a different way of marking it out. But when we talk about acts and scenes, the act is the larger umbrella, and inside the umbrella are tiny little scenes that make them up. And they can be longer or shorter. There's no real set rules about how long and short an act and scene is. So the next thing is we have these 3 terms that all go up in the beginning of a play. We have an inciting incident. This is the plot point or event that hooks the audience into the story. This is the moment that thrusts the protagonist into the plot. It disturbs stasis. Inciting incident can be a little bit tricky to figure out, but it's one of the tools that we use to determine who is the protagonist in a story. Because if this inciting incident didn't happen, the rest of the plot would not also occur. So that's one of the ways we want to think about that. And we'll talk about that more on Thursday in regards to where is the inciting incident in Fences. We have rising action. This is action that builds the plot. This is everything that rises in tension, heightens the conflict. This is why we use the term rising. Each one of these scenes that leads us to the climax. Finally, in this opening section of a play, we generally have a lot of exposition. An exposition is information given to the audience about past events in the plot or action that occurred off stage. We can't ever see everything in a play, right? I think it's really useful to think about reality television this way, in the way that it's edited. In reality TV, they film everything for multiple days, right? They're filming 24 hours. They have to put that 24 hours worth of filmed footage into an hour's worth of television, right? So in a reality television piece, they have edited the exact amount of information that we need. But sometimes we want to know what happens off stage. Sometimes we want to know what happens in another place, and they'll give us exposition about what happened before. Important things that we need to know. In Harry Potter, if you're familiar with that franchise, Hermione Granger is basically an exposition machine. Anytime they need to know something about what happened at Hogwarts beforehand or what was going on in the world, Hermione, who reads, just tells them because she knows the information that they need to have. And that's a useful way of thinking about exposition as well. Next, we have the climax of a play. This is the highest emotional peak of the play. And the way I like to talk about it, as I mentioned before, is it's the moment in the play that everything is leading towards and everything after is falling away from. And I'll talk about that more when we get to the Freytags model in a second. Next, we have falling action, which wraps up the narrative, resolves its loose ends, and leads towards the closure of the play. Finally, resolution. This is the closing scene, the end of the play, when conflicts are resolved and the story concludes. All of these elements are the basic building blocks of dramatic structure, and we need to understand what they are to understand how a play works. Another really important part of the play is the given circumstances. The term given circumstance comes from Stanislavski, who we'll learn a little bit more about later in the semester. But we can think about it in terms of playwriting as well, because we have a given set of circumstances that make up the whole of how a play works, right? This can be the rules of the world, the time that the play is happening, the location of the play, right? Last week we read Trifles, and the given circumstances of that play is that it's very realistic. It's set in a version of our real world. There is law and order in this world. It is set in 1916. It is set in New England on a country farm. So we have all of those given circumstances, and we can fill in the rest from there, right? If we put it in a urban area in the 1940s, right, you're going to have a whole different set of given circumstances for the play. And these will impact other aspects of design later in the production process. But when we're just reading a play, we want to know what the given circumstances are, because they will impact the choices that characters can and will make. It wouldn't make sense for magic to start happening in Trifles, right? This is not a world where a dragon will just appear. But there are plays where a dragon will appear and everyone will treat it normally. And those are the sort of information that we need to know that are part of given circumstances in a play. Here is a visual image that will help us understand what really happens in dramatic structure. This is called Freytags Pyramid. Freytag was a theoretical theorist for plays, and so this is his sort of diagram that helps us understand a linear causal play. What do I mean by linear? It means that all of the events of the play happen in chronological order. And causal, which is another term we'll get into more later in the course, means that each scene in a play triggers the scene that comes afterwards. Everything is connected. There are plays in which the scenes are not connected, where the action doesn't really impact the next scene. And we can talk more about that later in the semester. But for our purposes right now, Freytag's Pyramid describes a linear causal play structure. And what you see here is that the inciting incident is at the beginning, There's exposition, we have rising action, complications, reversals, and the climax happens at the top. And then the falling action, which helps us think about why those are called rising and falling, and the resolution or the denouement. Resolution and denouement mean the same thing, so you can use those words interchangeably or just use resolution if you don't feel like using fancy French words. This triangle is very equilateral, right? This is a simple plot. There's a lot of falling action in this play. Freytags Pyramid is a useful description of plots, but it rarely looks like an equilateral triangle. For example, it might end up looking like a mountain that the height goes on forever. We might have a small triangle, lots of falling action. There might be the climax happens at the very end of the play and there's very little falling action. So this triangle can look a lot of different ways, but it has all of these blocks, these building blocks and terms that let us see what the structure looks like. For all of our plays, we're going to be thinking about protagonist and antagonist. So in Fences, we want to think about who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. And they might be the same person. I'm going to just put that out there. It could be. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are. The protagonist carries the main theme of the play and usually goes through the greatest change. So what you want to think about when you're reading Fences, what is the theme of this play? Who's going through the greatest change? Lots of characters have change. In a good, well-written play, every character gets a little bit of development because it makes them interesting. You also want to think about the antagonist, the person who hinders the protagonist in his or her or their journey, right? And the antagonist can be a person, it can be the protagonist, it can be events outside of the play, it can be society, it can be nature. We can get into those kinds of stories a little bit later in the semester, but I want you to think about as you read, who is the protagonist, who is the antagonist, and the ideas of theme and greatest change will help you think about who those people are.